Welcome, everyone. This is our first GA4GH virtual fireside chat. We're very excited to have you here. It's a new series of webinars that we're hosting to help promote the benefits of genomic data sharing and interoperability, which are at the core of GA4GH and our mission. So many of you may have attended a GA4GH plenary meeting in the past, and those are these, great, dynamic, compelling discussions that we often have. And the whole idea with these fireside chats is to sort of continue those discussions and conversations throughout the year. So today we're delighted to be kicking the series off with a conversation between our CEO, Peter Goodhand, and Dr. Catalina Lopez-Correa. Catalina is the Chief Scientific Officer at Genome Canada and previously served excuse me, as Executive Director of the Canadian COVID-19 Genomics Network, or CanCOGeN, which is a $40 million initiative to advance the use of genomics to help us understand and control the COVID-19 pandemic. As part of her commitment to international development, Catalina has led several initiatives aimed at demonstrating the impact of genomics and innovation in developing countries, and she is fully committed to advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion with a particular interest in gender equity in science. And then just briefly, many of you know Peter. As I said, he's our CEO, having played a critical role in the inception and development of the organization. Excuse me. Before GA4GH, if you can imagine a time, Peter served as president and CEO of the Canadian Cancer Society, and before that held a 20-year career in the global medical technology industry. And he also served as president of OICR and is currently co-chair of the International 100,000 Plus Cohorts Consortium, or IHCC, and serves on the governance boards of the Global Genomic Medicine Collaboration, G2MC, and RareX. And so welcome to both of you. We're excited for this discussion. And Peter, I will let you take it from here.
Thanks, Angela. And welcome, everybody. I see we've got about 30 people joined us so far and expecting a few more. We're going to try, time permits, we can try and get through four different topics. One that's top of mind for many people, COVID-related activity that Angela just referenced. Work on the Silent Genomes project and Catalina's other perspectives on working closely with Indigenous communities in a country like Canada, and then switching to the challenge of working in other countries, particularly in low middle income settings. And then as Angela mentioned, this particular commitment Catalina has to advancing the role of women in science. We'll try and get to all four. Just before we do get into those specific areas, Catalina, do you just want to give us a few perspectives on that career path that led you to your current role and some key learnings along the way? Over to you.
Well, and thank you, Peter. Thank you, Angela, for the invitation today. It's a real pleasure to start the Fireside, and I think it's going to be fun and interesting to have this discussion. So, it's interesting, the question, Peter, about, how I got here to be now CSO at Genome Canada. And when I tell my story, you always tend to tell your story like in a linear way. Oh, I did this, and it seems like also easy and straightforward, and I would say my path is nothing but linear, even though I can tell you the linear path, but it's always, there's always so many bumps in the road and so many challenges, beginning from, studying medicine in Colombia and trying to leave the country. I left Colombia in '93 in the midst of a really difficult situation in the country. So I went in to do, my studies, my master's in France, PhD in Belgium. And again, when you tell it like this, sounds like easy. Oh yeah, I went to France. Like, you just buy a ticket and go to France and do your master's and everything is fine. But, in each of those steps, there are so many barriers and challenges for, not just for, whatever individual, but, if you add to that, woman in science, if you add to that a person with a strong accent in English and in French, so all these little things add to make sometimes that path challenging and not so straightforward. And then from there, finishing my PhD in Belgium, I went to work in England with a biotech company. I was already, after so many years in medicine, so many years doing the master and the PhD, I decided to go to the private sector. And I started with two small biotech companies that were headquarters in the US, but they were opening operations in the UK. That was a very interesting experience. First time working in a company, biotech in the year 2000. That's really where biotechs were booming, in particular in the area of data and bioinformatics. I was the first biotechs working with some kind of software and hardware and software for genomic analysis, just right after, at the time of the Human Genome Project. And for them, I would say the boldest decision I had taken was to go and take a position at CanCOGeN in Iceland, Reykjavik, like nothing I've seen before, a whole new world, country, culture, and a company that was that has been leading the world in genomics and genetics. So that was an amazing experience, 4 years there. And from there, we moved to the US to work with Eli Lilly for a few years. And we decided to just conscious decision to immigrate to Canada in the year 2000. That's make Canada our home. And we came here in the year 2008, actually. 2008, we moved to Montreal, Quebec, and I worked with Genome Quebec for 8 years. Amazing experience knowing Quebec, working with my colleagues at Genome Quebec. It was really wonderful. From there, we moved to BC, and I worked with Genome BC for 4 years before we decided to go back to Colombia for a little bit of a experience there. We, of course, didn't plan for a pandemic that hit us in the middle of our experience there. So we finally returned to Canada December 2020 to I took the job, I'm sure we'll talk about leading the Canadian COVID Genomics Network at the time in June 2020. So as I say, it sounds like straightforward, but is always nothing but straightforward and nothing but always bumps in the road.
Thank you. What's fascinating is, so for most of that second half, that Canadian piece, we've interacted, I guess, since 2012 or something like that, because you've definitely been part of the GA4GH community almost from the very beginning, because the support we got from Genome Quebec and
Absolutely.
then Genome BC, and then we've done. So it's interesting to hear all the path that led up to your time in Canada. You did mention CanCOGeN, and that was the thing that certainly you put so much time and energy in when you returned from Colombia. And it was a fairly rapid response to the pandemic. So can you tell us a little bit more about CanCOGeN? What was it that brought you back to take on that challenge? And what have you been the key learnings from this 2 years almost of working in unusual circumstances?
Absolutely, Peter. Such an incredible, I would say, opportunity, like professionally and also for Canada. I was already in Colombia working, coordinating a network of labs doing the PCR test that, as you can imagine, for a developing country with limited resources, limited capacity in terms of labs and in terms of even, PCR machines and knowledge and expertise, that was a difficult task. We set up that network in the first months, April, May, we started to set up that network. And then suddenly I saw this opportunity with Genome Canada to lead the Canadian COVID Genomics Network. So they were already granted $40 million by ICED, the federal government. When I saw that, it was like, okay, this is really the opportunity to have a global impact with genomics during a pandemic. Like, genomics can make so much difference and can help in so many ways. Just help us understand and control this pandemic using genomics and understanding the genome and also understanding the human side, because there was the two components. I mean, CanCOGeN is divided on $20 million for the viral sequencing and $20 million for the human sequencing. So when I saw that opportunity, I was like, well, this is really the opportunity to use genomics to solve and help address a global challenge like the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, that was the beginning I started with CanCOGeN in June 2020 from Colombia, working, of course, remotely like everybody was working, except that I was really remote in the middle of the tropic. And I would say one of the most challenging job experiences has been CanCOGeN, but also one of the most rewarding. As the extremes, really. CanCOGeN has been for me the extreme.
Yeah. And so obviously it's top of mind for everybody, and we'll have people from many different countries and their own experience. We've seen countries do very well in the beginning and then have lost track of it and they're going backwards, and others that were struggling to control the pandemic in the beginning now starting. In Canada, we've seen our different provinces at very different rates and still do today. But when you think about all that tremendous experience you had in human genomics in different fields, thinking about rare disease, thinking about pharmacogenomics, what's been the biggest difference to bringing that learning from your genomic career into pathogen genomics and in the middle of a pandemic? What's been the big difference?
Yeah, that's a good question, Peter. You know, I think we have a span, and together, you know, we're working together also, well, Global Alliance, and we're working together on G2MC that is focusing on the implementation of genomics in the clinic, the clinical use of genomics. So I have been in the last, 10 years when we're moving from more fundamental research in genomics into more applied and clinical implementation. The whole objective of the last 10 years has been trying to implement this in the clinic. And here we are from one day to another one with this pandemic, not just trying to think how we will implement, but really all the way using genomics. Because the setup we had for CanCOGeN, we decided from the beginning was to engage directly with the public health labs. So we were really going directly from we didn't go like the UK, they work with academic groups. So they were still a little bit on a research mode. We jumped immediately into implementation mode. And that's challenging because, you know, we didn't have the setup. The labs were not prepared. They didn't have the personnel in Canada. They didn't have the capacity, the equipment. We had the funding, and we had to ramp up this capacity, to ramp up in terms of equipment, personnel, and also, I will say, you know, it's a whole different practice when you are dealing with the public health labs that are used to manage their outbreaks on a local level, at a provincial level, and they have some ways to, to share the data, but inside their particular networks and their particular protected kind of firewall. Whereas here, facing a pandemic, the whole idea was to, implement it quickly in the provincial health labs, but at the same time, share the data. That was the key element, sharing the data. So that was actually one of the biggest challenges during CanCOGeN. We were able to ramp up the capacity, train the bioinformaticians, train the people in genomics, get the labs up and running. But sharing the data has been an interesting learning and an interesting challenge.
Yeah, and I think many of us now thinking about, yes, COVID has taught us a lot. So as we think about pandemic preparedness for the future, how best can we learn from this and make sure that next time around international data sharing is possible from a human, from a level, from a trust basis, and from a technical level. So we have a question from Bertha talking about members of the GA4GH and the Genome Quebec family. She says, Decode, Genome Quebec, Genome BC all face political side challenge and scientific challenges. How did you survive?
Oh, well, Bertha, I think I've learned a lot from you actually to survive in political environments. I think for me, the key, I would say I always, I work hard. I always go, giving the maximum of myself in every place I am. And I figured that more and more, one key element for me is empathy and just getting, connected to people in a real way. making those real connections with humans. We work with humans, so making those connections through empathy and leading with empathy has been one key element for me. Empathy, transparency. So that's of course I have to navigate complex environments and cultures. Is not just political. Some cases also cultural difficulties or differences. Icelanders are, very, very different from the people, Quebecers, very, very different from people in British Columbia, now very different from, the people I'm working with in Ottawa and managing more the federal. So it's a lot for me, is really hard work, passion. I'm passionate about genomics. I'm passionate about the power genomics has and what we can do with this technology, bringing that, to every place I go, and bringing that empathy and I would say transparency. And, first and foremost, we're working with humans and make that as a, top #1 priority.
So I think you just gave us a perfect transition to topic number 2, because I can't think of a setting where it's more important to think about empathy, transparency, and finding a way to bring that passion, but to bring it with respect, than in working with Indigenous genomes. So I know another project that you've been very associated with over the years is the Silent Genome Project. Can you tell us a little bit about it, but perhaps more importantly, what are the learnings from working with Indigenous peoples on the special aspects of genomics?
Absolutely, Peter. And well, I would not really claim to be an expert working with Indigenous communities. I think, I'm learning and I'm passionate about it. I'm really working hard to learn every day. My relationship with the Silent Genomes goes back to 2016, I think, where we started to work with the team to prepare them for this big LSARP competition. So I was in Genome BC, and I started to work with the team since they started to conceive this project. And it was interesting because when the project started, their internal discussions, and when we started to have them, invite them to Genome BC to talk about their project, their ideas, what was the objective. The initial objective of the project was to build a library. So focusing on the numbers, the patients, the recruitment, the variant library, to see what variants are more prevalent in Indigenous communities as compared, or Indigenous people as compared to other Caucasian populations. But what is more interesting really is that the more we started to talk about the project, and the more we started to draft that together, of course, with the team, and the team started to realize that the real objective of that project is not the library. The real objective of the project is to open this dialogue and really, as you say, with empathy, with respect, with transparency, start working with Indigenous communities, talk to them about genomics, talk to them about the project, develop the governance model, develop the informed consent, all that really more the governance and the dialogue and building bridges. And when Laura Arbor and Nadine Caron, that are the 2 PIs, present this project, they always present a nice photo with a nice bridge out in Prince George, up north of British Columbia. And it's all about building bridges. Historically, we have burned so many bridges and so many connections. So what is amazing from the Silent Genomes is that, they have at the end an objective of building a library, a variant library, and understanding what those variants are and how they differ from Caucasian populations. But the core of the project is this connection, is this bridge, is this really new relationship with Indigenous communities.
So, we have this conversation in other settings and recently, as we talked to CIHR Science Council. So that I'm guessing that almost everybody listening to this conversation recognizes why we need to diversify the genome reference sets, and how particularly challenging that is when you've destroyed trust in the past, and you need to rebuild the trust before anybody will work with you moving forward. But can you just tell us a little bit more about why this is? So that applies to all of science. So we've seen so much extractive science, helicopter science, whichever you want to call it. But it does feel a little bit different when we're talking about genomics and about the genetic identity of a people and not just an individual. So I think many of us are used to thinking about it, my DNA, my personal DNA. But I know when we talk to Indigenous communities, they see it as a much more collective ownership. And I know that's not just in Canada. So can you expand a little bit on the special circumstances when it comes to genomics and dealing with underrepresented or vulnerable or Indigenous people?
Yeah, well, Peter, as you mentioned, I think the big difference is that with Indigenous communities here in Canada, and I see the same with Indigenous communities in Latin America, is that getting access to your DNA is not just an individual, it's not just touching the individual, it's really touching the community. You go thinking about your ancestors, you really are much more, again, touching the entire community. And historically, well, we have seen it here, I've seen it happening lots in Latin America, as you mentioned. Helicopter research, basically where scientists from Europe, North America, they will come to Indigenous communities in Latin America, take samples, tell the communities that they will do a certain study. Like with Indigenous in Peru, there's a couple of cases that have been published where they say they will study their resistance to the altitude. Is there any genes that can confer them great physical capacity to thrive and survive and work and live in such a high altitude? And when they realized later on is really that their DNA was used for other ancestral studies, just in cases where they could or not claim land. So there are a lot of social, economical, and political implications when you come to study the DNA. And there is also underlying, I think, an historical mistrust just because of the helicopter research and misuse of data, misuse of some of those studies. And that's why really the Silent Genomes, when they were drafting their project, they went really back all the way to say, well, first thing is we need to build that trust. And yeah, it's not an easy path. And there's, I think the other key element, I would say also from the Silent Genomes, is that this is not a project. There are two PIs in this project. One is Laura Arbor out of UVic that has been working with Indigenous communities for many, many years. And the second PI is Nadine Caron, and she is an Indigenous woman from northern BC, a medical surgeon, and she knows the community. She is from the community, so that makes a whole difference.
Yeah. So I think you. Sorry, I'll let you have your water. I'll ask a long question while you're having a drink of water. Again, you already took us into this broader application. So we focused a little bit on Canada. Not surprising, given where we're both located. But I've also worked with you extensively through Global Genomic Medicine Collaborative. I think we've probably been in, but it's run in parallel to GA4GH, more focused on implementing genomics around the world, particularly in low middle income settings. So we talked a little bit about the challenges of doing research in low resource or low middle income countries and different populations. I know there are just as many, if not more, challenges when it comes to implementing genomic medicine in low resource settings. So can you tell us a little bit about why do you, given everything else on your plate, why do you take on things like G2MC at a personal level? And then what do you learn from that? Your career's been international. You now work globally. So tell us about the challenges of genomic medicine around the world.
Yeah, so Peter, as you know, I'm really passionate about that, and when you say right, I have a full-time job that takes really a lot. I mean, my time totally, and I still take on my evenings and weekends or whatever it is, this other challenge of trying to support developing or advancing genomics implementation in developing countries, and that's really because I fundamentally think that one of the biggest challenges we have with genomics is equity. And equity, we're seeing it now, with the COVID, really magnify in all areas with the vaccines and with genomics. We have big challenges in developing countries and resource limited settings to sequence those viral genomes, even though, it's only, 30,000 letters or base pairs genome. It's a tiny genome and should not be that complicated to sequence. But yet when you don't have the capacity, when you don't have the infrastructure, it becomes, and we don't have the funding, it becomes a real challenge. On those lines, George Catalinas and myself, George is also co-chair of the G2MC. We published a book in 2018, well before the pandemic. We edited that book together, and the objective, the book is called Genomic Medicine in Emerging Economies. So we had different, of course, chapters covering how genomic medicine is being implemented in Latin America, how genomic medicine is being implemented in Africa, Asia, different just examples and illustrations of the opportunities and the challenges. And there were 4 key messages that came out of that book overall, when we take into account all the chapters. The first one is the need to invest in infrastructure. So there is so limited infrastructure in most of those countries. And I think now with COVID, we have seen large investments of genomics in Africa, large investments around genomics in Latin America too. So infrastructure, really important. The second, education. So just training those next generation scientists, bioinformaticians, that's a key element. The third element was to promote local developments and local development of local technologies. So instead of, and we saw it with COVID, when they were in Colombia, we had big challenges when I was trying to set up this network. We had to import there was no way to develop a test for COVID locally. We had to import all the reagents, all the chemicals, everything. And of course, the entire world was buying those, and there were important shortages. And the country, even though we had the network set up, we couldn't get the test. We had the money, we had the network, we just didn't have the test. We just didn't have the reagents. So that's, so building that technological and just even chemical capacity locally. And the fourth is promoting South-South collaboration, we call it in the book, instead of North-South. Of course, North-South, there's good aspects, but I think we need to strengthen also the fact that those regions need to connect better between them. And I think actually H3 Africa, and now the network they are building around COVID genomics, led out of South Africa, is being an amazing example on how Africa is getting together to ramp up their capacity around genomics and sequencing the virus, sharing the data, sharing protocols all around Africa. Latin America has not been able to do that much on the beautiful network. They're still working country by country. They're somewhat helping each other, but they haven't been as far as creating a whole network like Africa did, which is, I think, a key element for the advancement of genomics in those countries.
You take me down a new, you just made me think of a new aspect of questioning that I hadn't thought about before. So I think we've all been impressed and delighted to see the work of H3 Africa. I know it's coming to an end of its current phase, and we're talking about 3 million African genomes from one group, and we're talking about a population cohorts, the all African population cohorts. But key to the success of H3 Africa there's not only been this deep commitment to work locally and work on the ground, but it has been the funding from NIH and from Wellcome Trust. And so when you think about Latin America, how much of this can be done locally with resources from in-country or in-continent, and how much of it needs additional support from that high resource settings, that the north-south, how important can that be in helping get things started, even if sustainability needs to be local?
Yeah, I think those international funding opportunities are key, and not just I will say for H3 Africa, also the fact that they set the standards in terms of data sharing, in terms of data, harmonizing the data, standardizing the data. I think those are critical elements. I will say for Latin America, that has been one of the biggest challenges. There's so far no initial conception of a network, and there haven't been an opportunity of an important funding like NIH coming and funding a network, or Wellcome Trust coming and say, okay, you guys get together, we will give you some money. The European Commission is doing some work with EULAC PERMED as part of IC PERMED, the International Consortium of Personalized Medicine. They have some ARANETs and some programs where they're bringing countries together around precision medicine and personalized medicine. So that in terms of policies and regulatory practices, they have put together some of the countries and starting to build a little bit of a network, but not really specifically on genomics. And I think I will say that the pandemic is a bit of a waste opportunity, because it could have been the perfect opportunity with the challenges the countries in Latin America had, a little bit like Africa did, to get together and build that network around the SARS-CoV-2 sequencing. Latin America didn't do it, and I think that's a challenge. Of course, the difference there is that they had more capacity than Africa. So each of the countries, and together they could sequence 3 or 4 times more than Africa was sequencing without that international support. So each of the countries already have some capacity and some funding to do that, and that's maybe the reason why they're doing it independently and not just working together to advance.
How, thinking about that, I know the situation is different in every setting, but what are the common, when it comes to influencing policymakers and funders in either in Latin America or anywhere else you've got experience, what's that best way to get policymakers, governments? We've seen that many of the national initiatives had leadership right from the top, from Obama, from David Cameron. So a big political commitment to put genomics on the map, the powerhouse approach. But how do you take that and build support outside the scientific community, outside the medical community, to raise the profile, the value in many of these different situations?
Well, I actually think, Peter, that the COVID-19 pandemic has been a unique opportunity to raise the profile of genomics. It's just incredible. I say, since I'm working with CanCOGeN, I say that with COVID-19, COVID-19 is taking genomics out of the lab, is really taking genomics to our living rooms. You see now people, we see genomics in the news, we see journalists, we see politicians, we see families, we see all kinds of, citizens talking about genomics and how the sequencing is the tool and the genome of the virus is the one that helps us understand if this is the Delta variant, the Alpha variant. So it's a unique opportunity to show the value. And I think, well, for Canada in particular, this super large investment in genomics has made a huge difference with CanCOGeN, and also is calling really for sustainability. So the discussions we're having now is not like, okay, we had $14 million, we could ramp up our sequencing really fast, we could build the capacity, we could hire the people, we generated those genomes. But now, how can we sustain that for the future? How can we make sure we are fully prepared with that capacity that we gained rapidly during this pandemic. And I think that extends to other areas, because then it's a bit, sounds a bit like maybe extreme, but for some politicians now, genomics is not the science fiction thing that you say, oh yeah, your genome, that's expensive, that's complicated, we don't even know how to manage the data. Here we have a very concrete example where important policy decisions, public health decisions have been made across Canada and across the world based on genomic information. I'm just amazed to see, here ABC and the provinces we're now with the National Microbiology Lab capturing all these success stories in terms of policy decisions and public health decisions. And you will not believe how many in the provinces, how many decisions were taken based on that genomic information. And then same for resource limited countries. I was amazed to see in the news sometimes in Colombia when the Delta variant started to show up. Once they could figure out with sequencing, of course, and with the genomes of the virus, they figured that the Delta variant was present. They make important decisions in terms of lockdown, all based on genomics. And that's happening across the world.
So it's, I think the challenge we're all going to face is, having built this tremendous groundswell of knowledge and support for genomics through COVID, is how do we talk about bridges, how do we bridge from once the pandemic spotlight has gone, how do we keep it going? I know one of your other topics, whenever we've discussed equity, diversity, inclusion, and whenever people are focused on the need for genomic diversity in the data sets, you've completely agreed and then gone on to say, but it's not just about in the data sets, it's about in the workforce. We've got to think about EDI in the workforce globally. And I know you've also had a special interest for many years on how best to increase the number of women in science, particularly immigrant and international women in science. So can you tell us about just how important it is to achieve diversity with that special emphasis on increasing the gender balance in genomics?
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. Another great passion. And I think, is I was not, when I was in the US or even working at Decode, I knew there were challenges for women in science. Iceland, of course, is an eye-opener. Iceland is a country that is so advanced on gender equity. And, I remember participating in March, strike, where women were out in the streets, and that was in the year 2005. Like thousands and thousands and thousands of women in the street, just striking and marching and all for equal pay. The year 2005, for me, that was a little bit of an eye-opener, and start to see, okay, what's happening here and why all these women, So then you start to open your eyes and to start to see the inequities and in science in particular. So in 2000, around 2016, I had a lot of people, a lot of women and young women coming to me, asking me for advice. I just arrived in Canada. You have been here for so many years. How should I go about my? And I was taking time to see each of them and to chat with them, have phone calls, have emails, have personal, a coffee chat. And then at one point I decided, well, I'm doing all this time in these 101 discussions. Wouldn't it be better to maybe have a little group where we can all chat about and we can all learn about our experiences? And a friend of mine, Olga Peña, we were discussing, and we'd say, well, she was doing the same in Ottawa and I was in Vancouver. Why not we try to put something together? We talked to other women, and we put together this international and immigrant women in science network that started in 2016. The idea was really to start, supporting each other, And it's not like, me, Catalina, that is now CSO, that knows everything. It's like we can learn all from each other. I learn from every single woman that is participating in that network. They all have amazing stories, amazing experiences that they share. And then so we started working on just also collecting data of, because I think an important area for us is to really know where we are. What are the real challenges, and collect that data to see what are the real numbers. How many immigrant women can access a job in their, where their expertise lies. So many of them come here with a PhD, super well trained, with work experience, and many cannot really find a job, a suitable job in their field. So capturing all that data, and that goes to your initial point, Peter, that when we talk about diversity in genomics, we often, I think, go to the simplistic thinking, in my view, that is thinking, oh, we need to increase the numbers in our database. Oh, we don't have enough cohorts that represent the diversity we have in the world. And that's true. And I totally think we need to increase the diversity in our cohorts. But diversity in our cohorts and our databases in genomics will not just go from just deciding to collect 1,000 more African genomes or 1,000 more Latin American genomes. It's a system that we need to change. And that's when I think we need to change the workforce. We need to change our committees at G4GH, GA4GH, at G2MC, at Genome Canada, the different organizations. We need to have those different voices. We need to have not just, and my initial passion was gender. Now my passion is not just gender. I started to kind of see a little bit more the other dimensions on diversity, including indigenous populations. So I think it's a whole paradigm shift. It's a whole different way that we need to address and see those challenges.
So I'm glad it's probably in the last 18 months that GA4GH has really stepped up and done it very deliberately. If I look right back to the beginning, we thought we were inclusive. We thought we were open to everybody, but it wasn't translating into those active participants and leadership positions. So we've put a lot more time and effort recently in thinking about what does it take to bring in a much more diverse leadership and participants. In some areas we've got, particularly in things like bioinformatics, it is just there seems to be a huge gender imbalance coming out of schools, coming into universities, coming into programs. And so we tend to be focusing on folks like you and saying, we need you on this committee, we need you on that committee. So kudos on creating a network, because there's no way a handful of people can do it. What about the input though? What about how do we increase the balance and diversity in STEM work right all the way back to the high school level? How do we make it more appealing, more attractive to everybody?
Well, I think there's work that needs to be done at so many levels, starting from even having role models. Like when I grew up, I couldn't think about a woman scientist that I could think, oh, I want to be like her. I want to just have this path like this woman. I only knew male scientists. I only knew, role models for me were male. So just starting from that, I think is an important change. But, it's a whole cultural shift. And I would say that, to your comment also, Peter, that when you say that you thought you were inclusive, so many of our organizations, we think that we're doing as much as we can. We're bringing, different people, we are fair in our processes, and we're not realizing our unconscious bias. We're not realizing that we don't know what we don't know. I just, as an anecdote, I remember when I went back to Colombia and I was leading a team of 120 just tech and scientists in an innovation hub. And we were 3 directors, and the executive director of the organization is a young male, passionate about technology. And I told him, I think we have an equity problem here. I think we have a little bit of a challenge. He told me, equity problem. We have 60% of the whole company, or 65% are female, are women. So what is the gender equity problem? And I say, well, we have not a single woman in our board. We have not a single woman in our external advisory committees. And we are not a single, I mean, I'm the only woman. And I just recently joined after 15 years where there were only male directors. I was the first female director for that organization. But for them, you know, for him, he didn't see it. And he was just like, Catalina, I just didn't realize. And it's funny because now every time I sit in a room, every time I'm invited to whatever committee, I'm counting how many we have. I'm counting how many Black people are in that committee. I'm counting how many disabled people do we have in that committee. I'm counting how many indigenous people we have in that committee. It's become like almost an automatic thing in my brain. And well, we're working with the universities. We're working because we also at Genome Canada, we have the challenge that lots of the people that will apply to our grants are, you know, they don't represent the diverse population we have in Canada. So in that case, we have to also work with the universities, work with the schools. I'm doing a lot of talks at schools, at you know, all kinds of other organizations. In Colombia too, we created series of groups that were super fun. That are women who coding, just girls coding and passionate about coding. And then you start to see that this stigma that, you know, women, they don't like bioinformatics, they do, they are passionate, they're good, they're brilliant. And when they get together and they have their own, you know, they don't have to follow the male prototype or the male model because they all, you know, they can be dressed with a little pinky dress that you will not in your mind, you always think about the, you know, Black dress bioinformatician. You know, we have all these stereotypes that we need to break down, and we need to think differently about all these roles and having those different role models that tell us we can do this and we can do it differently.
Thank you. We've got two audience questions. One's very much in the mainstream of GA4GH, so I'm going to save that for next. But the other one is a great follow-on to what we were just talking about, but it broadens the conversation. So it says, thank you, Catalina, for all the great insights you've shared. How would you recommend that private, academia, and public sector players in genomics collaborate to deepen the impact of genomic insights for the benefit of diverse populations? So I know we've had this conversation at places like G2MC, GA4GH. How do you cross these boundaries between private sector, public sector, and particularly dealing with industry? What do you suggest there?
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, Peter, lots of organizations like G2MC, you know, we are thinking about that actively. We're working with private sector companies. Some of those companies are starting to think more global and more a little bit about equity. Of course, some of them will have their commercial interests behind. But I think we as funders and as organizations as GA4GH, G2MC that have the opportunity to see what's happening in genomics on the global stage, I think we have an important responsibility to also educate those companies. And we had, in my case, I had help, you know, make interactions between Illumina and some of the networks or Regeneron. And there is an interesting shift in thinking that initially they will say, oh, we can give you sequencing for free, but we want to keep the data. And it's all this education that, okay, you know, the most important, of course, here is the data and who owns the data. And if we were going to talk to indigenous populations, they will, you know, keep their data and they will have to want to have control, which is totally right, want to have control on, you know, on the data. So I think it's a lot of us learning and just seeing also that the biggest challenge, as I say before, the biggest challenge for genomics is an equity challenge that I think we need to work all together, private sector, funding organizations, universities, and we are think, more and more seeing the opportunity, a little bit like we see with, again, I go back to COVID and SARS-CoV-2. We are not safe until we are all safe. So in that sense, we cannot fully benefit from genomics until we are all able to advance and really implement genomics into the clinic. So it's really a global challenge.
So you managed to get us right back to the other question that was in chat a little while ago. And this is more, it was related to COVID, but I think it does apply more broadly than COVID. But the specific question was around when you're working with the provincial public health labs on sharing the data. Did you, sorry, I just have to shut something down so I can read. I was getting competing chat messages. So COVID, provincial public health leaders, did you impose or require specific standards to ensure that the data met technical, scientific, security measures? Part one. If so, were those standards in alignment with international projects? And third, what were the basis for those standards?
Well, this is such a good question. And I will say impose is a big word. And it's not a Canadian word. We basically went, well, first worked in really strong and really tight collaboration with the public health labs, understanding their challenges, understanding their capacity and what they could and could not do. That was a very important component of what we were trying to do with CanCOGeN. We did develop standards. We actually, together with OICR and others, develop QA/QC pipelines, quality assurance and quality control pipelines for the data that was generated in the public health labs. And those, so we set up protocols for the sequencing that were shared across the entire network, CanCOGeN network. We set up these QA/QC pipelines that everybody ended using across the country and even internationally. They were using these pipelines for quality assurance and quality control. And in our contracts of funding, of course, we were asking for data sharing. That aspect is a little bit more challenging because some of the labs didn't have the capacity for data sharing or didn't have the, even, you know, from the technology perspective, they didn't have the automation needed in some cases to effectively share the data. And in some cases, we saw also, you know, culturally for them, that was maybe not the priority when you have 20 competing priorities in the midst of a pandemic where you need to sequence or you need to stretch so thing and people are so extremely busy. Maybe data sharing doesn't come as your top number one when you have to report to the provincial authorities and focus on your provincial use of the data. Sharing the data with the rest of Canada or sharing the data with the world is not your priority. But having said that, we did share our data, and we actually, our objective for CanCOGeN was to sequence a total of 150,000 genomes. We are, the report I got yesterday evening, we are at 276,000 genomes already sequenced, which is, you know, almost a double of our target. And we haven't even completed the 2 years of the project. So it's just incredible. Good news is like we're doing so much. Bad news means that we had a lot of infections and a lot of people, of course, sick with COVID. And we have now, from those 270,000 sequences, we have about 170,000 that are already in GSED, which is a public database that is being shared at an international level where all scientists across the world and all, you know, agencies across the world can access that data. So more than, again, more than our initial target of having 150,000, we have now 170,000 that are already shared with the world. So it has been an, you know, a bumpy road and not easy to get everybody on the same page about sharing. But I think it has been an amazing learning and an incredible outcome to see where we are now and have the numbers we have now.
So thank you. I can add a little bit to that because, as you know, through a grant from the other Canadian funding agency, CIHR, GA4GH has actually been tasked with making sure we've got interoperability on the 3 Canadian platforms, and the greatest possible interoperability between those Canadian platforms and international counterparts. So I guess a general call out from me to everybody on the call: if you've got a COVID initiative, particularly on the surveillance side in your country, then do contact us, because when we get early into next year, we're going to be reaching out to say, how can we take CanCOGeN and the ProVarNet and the other initiatives in Canada and link them using GA4GH standards and protocols to the international community. So Catalina, thank you so much for doing this. We're coming to the end of our time. I'll pass it back to you for just a couple of closing remarks, big things that either you forgot to say, you want to say again. What's your takeaway message for this community?
Well, I would say my first message will go to a woman in science. I see there's lots of women attending this Fireside Chat today. So I think it's important for all of us to believe in ourselves and really dream big. And I think, for me, I think I never dreamt about being CSO at Genome Canada or specific, but I always, since I was a child, I think was, big desire to see the world and to have an impact and follow my passion. So dream big and trust yourself. I think those are key important key elements. And Peter, on genomics and data sharing, I think we have a unique opportunity now, again, with the COVID-19 pandemic and the advances we have made on SARS-CoV-2 sequencing and sharing across the world. We have a unique opportunity to really take genomics to the next level. And organizations as GA4GH, G2MC, and of course Genome Canada are placed in a unique position to show the world the real impact of genomics and be a core part of what is really now the genomics revolution, which is changing everything and having an impact in every single sector of our lives in our economy. So I'm again super passionate to be part of this revolution and invite you all participating in this call to be an active part of this revolution.
I can't thank you enough for doing this. It's an early morning start for you, but I know, given the passion for your work, that's probably your normal start time. It's been great. As Angela said right off the top, this is the first in a series of fireside chats that we hope I think we'll have a conversation just like this and explore some aspects of the power and the promise of genomics, but through the lens of a leader in the field. So thank you for doing it. It's been a delight for me personally. And if there is an upside to COVID and the lack of seeing each other in person, it's that we do get to have many more of these virtual conversations, and we can have them with lots of people at the same time. So thank you for doing it. And I hope we'll post this later. If there is follow-up, please do contact a member of the GA4GH team, and we look forward to hosting our next conversation in the very near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you all for attending. Thank you.